Welcome to another edition of Between Sundays, and we continue through the book of Ecclesiastes looking for some wisdom. And chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, which we're going to look at today, has something really hard, I think, and really relevant to this very moment, which is kind of weird, right? Because this text is more than 2,000 years old. You know, it's more along the lines of 2,500 years old. And so for it to have something relevant today should really make us pause that this is something that we continue to see, and how are we responding? Because that's what it's really going to ask us. It's going to make us take a look at. So starting in verse 1, when I next observed all the oppressions that take place under the sun, I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no one to comfort them. Their oppressors wield power, but they have no one to comfort them. So I declare that the dead who have already died are far more fortunate than the living, who are still alive. But happier than both are those who have never existed, who haven't witnessed the terrible things that happen under the sun. The heading of this in the Bible is actually death is better than oppression. And if we think about that, first, we probably are a little startled by that thought that death is better than oppression. But when we begin to think about it, when we think about in the things that we see around us, would we want someone treating us with hatred? Would we want to be the ones who receive violence? Would we want to be starved? Would we want to live in poverty? Would we want, right? You see where I'm going with this? That this sense of, wait a minute, depending upon the oppression, we might say, you know what? Death may be better. And in this moment, we should really take stock of that. Kohelet here is observing. He's not necessarily at this moment giving a resolution to it or asking us to jump to action, but I am. I want us to think about that of when we see someone oppressed, do we say, or even a group oppressed, do we say, oh man, that bites. Glad it's not me. Or do we have empathy? Right? Empathy is a little different than sympathy. Sympathy is like, oh, yuck, yeah, glad, don't want to talk about it. Empathy is trying to get a perspective, is feeling with that person or a group of people. It's that sense of staying out of judgment and trying to sit with. Empathy causes connection. Sympathy drives us apart. And so in this moment, if we are bothered by these words of Kohelet, that death is better than oppression, then what are we doing? Because Kohelet observes that the oppressors wield power and that those who are oppressed have no one to comfort them. That sense that when we see someone being oppressed, that we go, wow, let me walk a mile in their shoes. Let me try to see it from their perspective. Let me stand back from judgment and try to figure out what's going on here to learn from it so that I can be a comfort to others. Think about that a moment. How are we comforting those that we see, observe, notice that they are oppressed? How do we engage in that kind of work? Because when we're thinking about wisdom, when we're thinking about how we use knowledge, how we actively engage with wisdom that is of God, not wisdom that says, hey, make sure you get all the power and you can hurt whoever you want to. Make sure you gather all the resources together so that no one else can have anything. And people may starve, but what do you care? You're sitting pretty. In this moment, we get this sense of wisdom with God has to engage us, has to ask us, how are we empathizing with people who are oppressed because they need to be comforted? Because Kohelet says, I don't see anybody comforting them. And if nobody's comforting them, then death is better. What a sad state of affairs. And it's kind of interesting because there's been some studies out that we as a culture in this country are beginning to lose empathy for one another, beginning to lose that non-judgmental, trying to take perspective, trying to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes, trying to kind of sit with others. And so how do we take that back? Because through all the stories we have here, through this biblical text, and especially when we get to Jesus, we find a whole lot about empathy with others. And so how are we going to let this Ecclesiastes 4 verses 1 through 3 challenge us today? Ask us to step out, and how can we begin to empathize with the oppressed? Have a good one.